Let's talk about tube amplifiers and preamps.
Right. Well, let's compare tube amps with transistor amplifiers.
Right.
So a transistor amplifier is well known by something you call a damping factor. So the higher the damping factor, which simply stating that the output impedance of the amplifier is extremely low. So it has no source impedance. And the speaker often has changing impedance because of the tuning of the box, and if it's a bass reflex, it has two big humps at the low frequency, and if it's got a mid-range driver or even a tweeter, you'll see the impedance go up on the woofer at the high frequency and the impedance go down of the tweeter, so you see these mountain up and down. Well, if you put a resistor in series with a tube or with a transistor amplifier, it kind of simulates what a tube amplifier would do. That becomes a voltage divider, so that the frequency response change of a tube amplifier based on its source impedance, and the higher the source impedance of a tube amplifier, the more it will accentuate those impedance changes, and it will actually change the frequency response of the loudspeaker.
Okay.
So some tube amps are less sensitive to that. You remember Sonic Frontiers? The Canadian tube amplifier company. They were eventually purchased by Paradigm, and then they changed the name, but I don't know exactly. But they had a very unique tube amplifier design. It had feedback in it, which countered the output impedance, and it drove a speaker with changing impedance just the same as a transistor amplifier. So it depends, like you were asking me earlier about, tubes and that sort of thing, and you can't just quantify tubes as being the holy grail or better than something else. It depends on how they're executed. But there's always a risk that if a tube amplifier or traditional tube amplifiers, the output impedance is high enough that they will be affected by the speaker's impedance. So each speaker will have its own change in frequency response depending on its impedance.
I use Magnepan speakers, and then I use a box speaker, passive. I have a Carver tube amp that's about 65 watts, just made a few years ago, and I have Carver solid state.
The planar speaker's impedance will be very flat, so you won't see the effect of the tube output impedance with a speaker that has a flat impedance.
Would it have a different sound, a different tonality, a different feeling, anything?
Shouldn't. Technically it shouldn't,
Okay.
but it depends on what's happening at the very high frequencies. Tube amps do have a bandwidth limit,
Right.
whereas transistor amplifiers don't.
It feels like it's a little softer on the high end, the tubes. Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
And it also feels like the low end is not as tight, if you will.
That's the reason. Because there's a resistor in series, the damping factor, the thing that stops the woofer if there's no voltage, isn't there anymore. So it gets a little sloppy.
A little looser.
Yeah.
Okay. So that does make sense. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and some people like that.
Right.
Okay. It doesn't mean that it's better. It's just
Flavor.
whatever the person likes.
Gotcha. Okay.
Nothing against tubes, but I'm just trying to explain what the differences are.
Right. So, for example, streaming versus vinyl. When I put on streaming, I like to run it through the tubes. When I put on vinyl, I like to run it through either, but it seems like the tubes soften up the hard edges of the stream a little bit.
Depends on what the recording is, how the recording is. Personally, I have no evidence that those are correlated, but you can hear differences, but you don't necessarily think that one is necessarily better, but I can recognize that there are differences. Yeah.
But it's tough to make these quantifiable judgments. It's really just use your ears.
Blanket statements, because the circumstances are important, and the differences exist. One thing about records is that I don't know how many people really understand this. If on a record you could put the full bandwidth without any correction or RIAA, you could only put one song on one side of an album, because the track would be so wide, and then that's right. Well, they have to, when they record it, when they create the record, they attenuate the low frequencies, so that it's squeezed onto the record, and at high frequencies they actually boost it so that those minute little things are more evident, so that needle can find them. So like that's not flat equalization, or like, you know, like there's. So why even bother when CDs came out? That was all gone, because everything's
Straight.
there's no EQ, there's no RIAA or anything. So
Thank you so much for telling us. Such a pleasure, Paul. Thank you so much.
no problem.
Thank you.
Thanks.
It's Thomas Mulready from Cool Cleveland here at the 2024 AXPONA.